The Committee on the Present Danger China was founded 5 years ago by myself, Steve Bannon, and Frank Gaffney. Our purpose was to explain to our countrymen the existential threat from Communist China, because we believed our countrymen did not fully appreciate this. Now, if what I have to say today sounds alarmist, I don't mean to be alarmist. I mean to be alarming, because in my judgment, we are completely underestimating Communist China and the threat that they pose. And I think it bears saying, even though this is not my exact topic, that Communist China has three great enemies in this country: Donald Trump, Steve Bannon, and Peter Navarro. Two of them are in prison. One of them was supposed to speak to you today. The other, President Trump, they would like to put in jail sometime this summer. Don't know if they will or not. We're in a political war with Communist China. It turns out Xi Jinping and Joe Biden share something in common. They both share those three political enemies. I'm not saying that's a conspiracy that those three men have been attacked this way politically, but you can see the nature of the political war we're in. And until we fully appreciate that, we cannot orient ourselves to deal with the problem at hand. Our representatives here in Washington do not do a very good job representing us. To say that the Congress is feckless would be an understatement. And so whatever I have to say today, let me say, I mean to curb your enthusiasm about this bright future of ours. I would love for there to be a bright future, and I am an optimist by nature, despite everything I'm going to say. The odds of us winning today, by us meaning Americans, is pretty remote. The odds of President Trump winning in November are probably less than 5%. The odds of the Congress being held are probably the same, and the Senate. All this good news, as much as I would like it, it's not there. And we can't, as a people, be delusional about this. This optimism is entirely misplaced given the political war we find ourselves in. Now, it may not get discussed much over the next 3 days, but I will say, I believe, as do many Americans, most Americans, that the 2020 election was stolen. The odds of the 2024 election, you will discern from what I just said, are very, very high. And we're not going to talk about this because we're nice boys and girls and we don't want to upset one another with the reality that an election can be stolen. Whether it's from radical leftists in this country, from Antifa, Black Lives Matter, the money behind, all of this, from Arabella Advisors, the Tides Foundation, and their condominium with the Chinese Communist Party and their malfeasance and their operations in this country. The war we've been in started in May of 2019 when Communist China declared a people's war against the United States. They did it in People's Daily. It was also announced in Xinhua News in Communist China. When President Trump said he was going to stop the theft of American intellectual property by Communist China, shortly thereafter they declared their people's war. They said to their own people they were going to have to sacrifice to fight the aggressive greed of the Trump administration, as if our intellectual property is something that is theirs. Now, I mention all this because within 6 months of that declaration, COVID was spreading throughout China and the world. Within 6 months of that, we were in lockdown, and within 6 months of that, a presidential election was stolen. That's just a fact. Now, whether COVID-19 was spread on purpose or whether they exploited it for political advantage, we can argue about that. But until we orient ourselves intellectually that that's the war we're in, and our enemy, Communist China, is prepared to do anything in order to achieve victory. If we can't orient ourselves that way, there's a kind of delusion. And it seems to me we can't talk about discrete policy issues, whatever they may be, however worthwhile they may be. I'm all for stopping pornography. I'm all for, making sure kids have good educations. But if our nation and its political system can be stolen from us, then all those things are kind of irrelevant. And as I say, I'm an optimist about these things. I, like Dave, think we can overcome these things, but we're not on track for that today. Now, I'm actually supposed to talk, Yoram very kindly said, talk about China, and he was very curious about the fact that America needs to make things again, especially weapons. And David Goldman gave an excellent presentation on why we need to invest a lot more in actual industrial infrastructure to be able to build weapons. But I've been looking at this, and let me just go through a few things. There's something called the Gavini Report, and it's used by industry insiders. They use artificial intelligence in order to take all the contracts, all the requests for proposals, they run them through artificial intelligence, and they try to find where the money is being spent. And I don't think you're going to be surprised, especially from what David Goldman had to say. But let me point to three areas that I think illustrate our lack of clarity about our national survival. First is nuclear modernization. Now that means we have to have nuclear weapons that are reliable, that have computer systems within them that guide them, that run them, that make sure that they can be robust. We haven't tested a nuclear weapon, let me say, since 1992. That alone seems kind of crazy to me. But today, just in the normal course of things, when it comes to our nuclear modernization, it will require 82 suppliers from Communist China, for us to buy the critical materials we need for our own nuclear modernization. And even then, we're not doing enough for that nuclear modernization. In the area of advanced manufacturing, which is a specialty category to describe all sorts of parts that we need, the U.S. will contract with 118 Communist Chinese companies, and that's up 223% just over last year. Semiconductors and advanced microelectronics. We take the most important electronics that are required, and we get those from 126 companies within Communist China that are critical to the U.S. supply chain, and that was up 186% over last fiscal year. All of these parts end up in our fighter aircraft, naval vessels, including destroyers and aircraft carriers, the reliability of which, by the way, is on the decline. They end up in the computers that run the various systems that are integrated throughout the U.S. military. And of course, nearly every part of our lives, from the laptop computers to our cell phones and the electronics that run this room, are using parts from Communist China. And it should also be noted that the transformers Dave Harvelitz was talking about, that they come from Korea or Communist China. During the Trump administration, they actually decided to open up one of them from Communist China, and it turns out there was electronic components and software which would have been a backdoor accessible to the People's Liberation Army. So we buy these amazing transformers. There's 250 or 300 around the country that are absolutely critical for the distribution of our electricity. The ones we get from Communist China have software built into them that would allow them to turn them off. Again, a form of insanity. Communist China has a cyber army of some 600,000 men. Would we expect that if we were in a war with them, they might use those 600,000 men to turn off our power grid? It would be unreasonable to think that they wouldn't. I would also note that in 2020, when Americans were complaining about the origins of COVID-19, what did Communist China say? That if we continue to complain, they will drown us in a sea of coronavirus, because 80-some% of the active pharmaceutical ingredients that we use for our medicines here in this country are made in Communist China. Again, that's insane. So you would turn over to a country that sees itself as your enemy. You would turn over the production of key things like military equipment, key parts of the electric grid, and pharmaceuticals. It's almost like we're engaged in a kind of national suicide here, that we don't want to see what's really transpiring. What should be built? First, there's battlefield munitions. We're short on those. We want to engage in wars all over the world. We don't have enough battlefield munitions. Whatever you think of the policy of the war in Ukraine, we don't have enough munitions to help them. We don't have enough munitions to help Israel. And as David pointed out, we have a lot of money in this country, but we don't spend it the right way. If you were serious about all this, you'd make sure we were rebuilding today the American military. You'd have fighter aircraft that were superior to anything in the world. Communist China has fifth-generation fighter aircraft. They may not have as many as us. Their pilots may not be as good as ours. They believe that quantity has a quality all its own. They'll build more, whether it's cruise missiles or fighter aircraft. They have a bigger Navy than we do. We're not today a serious country. We build about a dozen freighter ships a year in this country. Communist China builds about 1,000. They're a big country. They're serious about being the master race of this earth. We don't seem to think that that's part of our job. Let me make a final point here. Communist China spends $16 billion a year here in the United States in intelligence and influence operations. 16 billion with a B. That's not defense spending. That's intelligence and influence operations here in the United States. They buy up the big law firms, PR firms. They spread money surreptitiously to journalists, to scholars around the country, to the media, whether they know it or not. They're being conditioned that we ought not to worry about Communist China. Everything's fine. They just want to engage in trade, and all is well. Don't bring back someone like Donald Trump who's willing to stand up for America. This is the point I started with, and I'm going to end with this. Everyone's going to vote in November. And they're going to vote with an electronic voting system that will have components made in Communist China. Almost all the machines you will use to vote on will be made outside the country. I've written this long article for the Claremont Institute's American Mind, in which I speculate whether or not the election can be stolen. Communist China has warehouses all over the country. They're spending $16 billion in intelligence and influence operations. Would they take a fraction of that, and in those warehouses, would they use printers? They have access to printers. They have printers. They make the printers. They have the paper. They have access to the voter rolls. They have artificial intelligence that they can use to gather everyone's signature surreptitiously. Would they, if they wanted to control the most powerful nation on earth, would they use their immense resources to produce 1 million ballots in the 7 swing states in order to decide an election for a soft on China president? Now, I would humbly say to you, I don't mean to be the bearer of bad news, But we have done nothing to ensure in 2024 that we're going to have a fair election. Nothing. The RNC has done nothing. It's all performative. And so until we're willing to wake up and see that this country can be lost this way, we are at a real disadvantage. And I would say this country of ours is a still great country, but it's not because of our elected officials or our elites. It's because of the American people. And they deserve much better than what they're getting today. Thank you very much for listening.